Welcome, everyone, to this conversation that we're having at Focolare Media. We're glad that you are joining us. My name is John M. Sweeney. I'm the editor at Living City Magazine, and this is one of our Living City conversations. We are here live with Christopher White, who is coming to us from his apartment in Rome. Chris is the Vatican correspondent for National Catholic Reporter, NCR, and he's been doing that for, 2.5 years. He moved to Rome, became the Vatican correspondent after having been NCR's national correspondent, where I know he spent a lot of time covering the 2020 presidential election in the US, which had all sorts of religious overtones and implications, and he got lots of experience doing that. And now he follows Pope Francis around every day and travels with him. And I want to ask him what that's like and what they serve on the papal plane and all that sort of thing. But welcome, Chris White. Thanks very much for being here with us.
Thank you, John. It's great to be with all of you, and I was very, very pleased to receive this invite to chat more about the Synod, because it's and just everything around the Vatican, because it's an exciting time, and lots of people have questions and curiosities about what's going on here. So any chance I get to help make sense of this sometimes strange and confusing place, I'm happy to do so.
Well, we appreciate that, and we did tell folks that if they join us, they have an opportunity to ask you their questions. So we will get to that. What I propose to everyone, those who are on the call, is that when a question occurs to you that you would like to ask, if you would type it in the chat. And I would imagine you know what I'm talking about. There is a Zoom protocol that we all have become well schooled in. And I will see those in the chat and I will ask them. When the time comes, I was going to start with my first, my own 3 or 4 or 5 questions. And then when we get to the bottom of the hour, I'll start looking to your questions and ask them for you. So why don't we start, Chris, with synodality? You contributed to the last issue of the magazine that was dedicated to synodality. And I'm sure everyone has seen that, and that's part of what prompted them to join us today. We know a lot about synodality. We're hearing all about synodality. Our bishops sometimes are paying close attention to it. Sometimes they're not. I have to confess, I've started to get weary of synodality already, and I know that's not what I'm supposed to do as a faithful Roman Catholic. So tell me, don't tell me what synodality is, because I hope that we all are already sort of have a sense of that. But tell me, is it here to stay, and what does it mean? What does Pope Francis seem to think that it is going to mean long term?
Yeah, I was having this conversation a few weeks ago with someone, and just the difficulty of the nomenclature of synodality to begin with. I mean, it's one of those words that editors such as yourself cringe at most of the time, I think, because it's clunky. It requires a bit of unpacking. In fact, I mean, my sort of shorthand that I would use in print a lot during the month of October, especially, was, to avoid using the word, was, Pope Francis's high stakes summit on the future of the Catholic Church. But when I was talking to some friends, I thought of the the Justice Potter Stewart test, when he talked about pornography, and you know it when you see it. And in a sense, that is actually what we saw a lot of last month in Rome, 2 months ago now, during the month of October, during the Synod, is it actually being put into practice, and giving us a sense of what it could be, its possibilities, its limitations. And I mean, that was an exciting time. I mean, I was here in Rome in October of 21 when Pope Francis officially opened the Synod. And at that meeting, there were about I'd say around 200 people from around the globe that had come to Rome, mostly from within Europe, because at that point there were still COVID restrictions. But there was a big mass to officially launch it. And we all had the sense that something special was happening, but it was hard to put our fingers on what exactly this was. And over the past 2 years, we've gotten some glimpses at that. First there were the listening sessions, and in places such as certain pockets within the United States, you wouldn't know there was a synod happening at all. But then I remember last summer going to Kenya, and in the diocese of Nairobi, being told that they had over 5 million people participate in their listening sessions. So, I mean, you get this sort of mixed implementation on the ground. But what was so critical to see here in Rome was what I kind of described at a certain point as the Pope's synodal boot camp. The whole month provided an exercise in the practice of synodality. And in a sense, images told the story better than words. I mean, it was people sitting at round tables with lay people and bishops having to sit shoulder to shoulder and listen to one another in an active sort of way about the hopes and fears and aspirations of for their church, of people's fears and concerns and joys for their church, what they'd like to see in it, what they don't want to see in it. It was in the effort to create a space to contain a lot of the tensions that do exist in the church and the world, to allow these conversations to take place in a civil way, for the church to say, we're not afraid of these conversations happening, to put these things on the table, to provide the space for that. And I think most importantly, it was an effort for the church to recover many of the ideals of the Second Vatican Council that I think a lot of Catholics felt were long overdue in their implementation of a church that invites all of the people of God to participate in the life of the church. And that's what the month-long session in Rome provided a bit of a laboratory of. There are obviously lots of things that worked, many things that need tweaking, and some things that didn't work at all. But I think that is sort of the quick assessment. What did the Synod accomplish? Well, first and foremost, I'd say it accomplished a laboratory for synodality to be practiced. You asked, is it here to stay? I mean, that's a tough question. I did an interview the day after the synod ended with my colleague Josh McElwee and with Cardinals McElroy and Supich, and they used the phrase that it would be impossible to go back to a time where there were synods that didn't take account and provide space for the laity. So obviously nothing is set in stone, but I think a lot of people do feel that something, the genie is out of the bottle, and that it would be very hard to try to contain this. So again, that's kind of a lot of information, but that's sort of some broad brushstrokes as to sort of what was at work the past few months here in Rome.
Well, that's wonderful. And I read your reporting all the time, and I'm sure that a lot of the folks on this call do that as well. And you've covered those things very well. And thank you, by the way. And that's a segue to, I want to ask you about yourself a little bit. Now, you're a great journalist, and so I know you're not supposed to be the story, right? But I want to very briefly make you the story, if you don't mind. Can you just give us a little personal detail? This is the kind of thing that people who follow you online and at NCR don't really get from you. So I thought it would be nice if we could hear personally from you. Where did you grow up? Are you a cradle Catholic? And if you don't mind, tell us what synodality feels like to you as someone who has been in the church.
Yeah. Well, John, as a biographer, how difficult it is to try to, to feel.
I'm not writing it down. No one's writing this down.
No, I know, but the instinct is to remove yourself as far as possible from the story. But yeah, I was born in South Carolina and raised as a Protestant, as a Pentecostal, in fact. And so spent the first 17 years of my life there. And then when I moved to New York in 2005, I felt as if I, for the first time in my life, was given a chance to really think about what I believed and why. And through a bit of a meandering journey, ended up in well, the route went through Paris, and in 2007, I was spending a year studying in Paris, and decided, mainly out of a love of art and architecture, to go to as many churches as I could in Paris. And when I came back, I just started attending Mass. And sometimes when people hear me say that, they think that I'm deeply invested in the liturgy, and I'm not someone that engages in sort of liturgical turf wars, but it really was the first time I had been introduced to sort of the Mass, and was profoundly affected by that. And so there was never an aha moment, but it was sort of just my sort of ascent into into practicing as a Catholic. And I lived in New York from 2005 to 2021 when I moved over here to Rome. And after I finished graduate school at Fordham, I really wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do. I knew more than anything I enjoyed writing. I had studied ethics and wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do with that, but I loved writing, and it also coincided with this was all right after the election of Pope Francis. And I was certainly intrigued by, what was happening in the global Catholic landscape. And so started writing a lot about sort of all things Catholic. So freelanced, and then I got my start in Catholic journalism, covering the U.S. Church for the Catholic news outlet Crux, and worked for them for 5 years. And during that time, I was very happy to be brought over to Rome with great regularity, multiple times a year. John Allen, who founded Crux and effectively gave me my start in this strange little world of Catholic journalism, was very generous and insistent that in order to understand the global Catholic landscape, a big part of that is understanding how Rome works or doesn't work. And so I got brought over here and covered a few synods with Crux and big Vatican meetings, and I got to do a papal trip with them. And so when I moved over to NCR in 2020, even though I was their US correspondent, I was always keeping an eye on the Vatican. And then when my colleague, Josh McElwee, who was our longtime Vatican correspondent, moved back to the States to serve as NCR's news editor, they asked if I'd consider moving over here. And well, here I am. So
Well,
that's
that's wonderful. That's wonderful.
that's my quick, life story. So
Thank you. No, I love it that people get to hear that. And it's good to meet you in that way. So you're now in Rome, and you have one of those jobs that some of us envy. Um, there's a bishop who I really like in the States, and I have sometimes said to my wife, when he becomes Pope, I want to be his chief of staff, and I'm moving to Rome. I'm sure that's never going to happen. But anyway, I have often looked at people like you and like Josh and John Allen and others and thought, wow, what a great job that would be. And you get to fly on the plane and follow the Pope around and be immersed in all that interesting stuff all day. So is it a great job? Where do you live? What's the neighborhood you're in? And where are you going for dinner tonight?
Yeah, it is absolutely a great job. I mean, there are times, on days when it's less chaotic, when I'm taking a leisurely stroll home from meeting someone, and I look up and, just take in sort of the sights and sounds of Rome. I think, wow, I'm really fortunate to be here. I often say that I feel like I'm back in graduate school because I'm reading all the time, I'm writing all the time, and I'm somehow always behind. And that feels, when you're covering a beat like the Vatican where something is always happening, there is this kind of constant pressure to be on and to make sure you're not missing anything, any bit of news. So you tend to overstack your calendar with coffees and lunches and dinners. to talk to people. I mean, that's a huge part of what I do, is just go around and talk to people and ask them, what's up? What do they know? Who are they talking to? What's the latest? And I often say that, I cover the Vatican like a New York Times reporter covers the White House, trying to cover it from every angle and understand the machinations of power. The Vatican, of course, is different because there's the spiritual dimension to to it all. But it's a real education, and I can't say how grateful I am to be here and have a front row seat to cover this papacy. I live just north of the Vatican, so I can be in a neighborhood. Those of you that are familiar with Rome, it's called Prati. I can be at the Vatican in about 10 minutes time, maybe 8 or so if I'm really rushing. And that allows me to bounce over for coffees and then run back home and do a bit of writing. And my entire life kind of exists in this orbit. I run into bishops that work inside the Vatican at the grocery store and things on a Saturday morning, and odd things like that. That's the best part of it's, often I imagine it's what a Capitol Hill reporter is like when, you're out for a walk and you see someone you're covering. And sometimes you let them live their life, and sometimes you go up to them and say, can I ask you a few questions? It really depends on the day and, and what's pressing. So, I tend to, we're very fortunate at the National Catholic Reporter that the Vatican is of great interest to our readers. So, I mean, what I try to do is work on, a lot of, bigger pieces to put things in context. But we try to provide, coverage from anything from what the Pope is saying at a mass to his travels to larger pieces of putting it all in context through profiles of various Vatican figures. This town has no shortage of interesting characters. And so it's, I think, a reporter's dream to kind of just to sift through it all.
Have you ever gotten a tip from a Swiss guard?
From a Swiss guard, no. No, when I moved over here, my Italian tutor was the tutor to the Swiss guards. And normally when I encounter the Swiss guards, I often chat about our experience having her as a teacher.
It gives you an instant rapport.
Exactly. That's sort of the Swiss guards are amazing. They work incredibly long hours, and often and not great, Roman heat, or days like today where it's really lousy and there's tons of rain and thunderstorms. And they're at the service and protection of the Pope, and they really carry out their work with great professionalism. And
Well,
I
you
tend to
didn't mention they get to wear those killer uniforms.
Those killer uniforms that aren't so killer in Roman heat, though.
I want to ask you about so when Pope Francis was elected in 2013, one of the signals that were sent either intentionally or unintentionally or both by him were the subtle things about how business as usual was going to be changed. And it was some of the anecdotes that a lot of us really loved in those early months. I'm sure you remember this too. The hotel bill that he tried to pay, and everyone focused on his shoes, and they were like a sort of a working man's shoes. They weren't fancy, and some of these great anecdotes about him being an ordinary person, one of the faithful who also now happens to lead the church. What I want to ask is those intangibles that are really important to a lot of us, where do you, because you have a front row seat to see those things.
Yeah.
What do you see in terms of those intangibles with regard to synodality? And how does he show in these little ways that I can't possibly see from where I sit? How does he show that this is something that's here to stay and is really meant to transform the church?
Yeah, I mean, I think for starters, the very act of a name change from, if you look at, let me grab a prop here. Um, this is the big Vatican yearbook, effectively, the annuarium. And it has the names of priests and bishops from all over the world and gives kind of a breakdown of every Vatican office. And the office that ran the synod was always the Synod of Bishops. Now it is just the Synod, period. And I think the exercise in recognizing that the Synod has to be all of the people of God is a great gesture of humility that comes from a disposition of wanting to listen and wanting to understand the experiences of Catholics from whatever their station in life. And so that same humility that led him to, shun a lot of the traditional vestments or to go to the hotel, I think is what motivates him. And I think, if you were to rewind the clock, this didn't just happen overnight. I mean, I think to understand the Pope's real commitment to synodality, you could really go back to Aparecida in Brazil in 2007, where the bishops from Latin America had undertaken a 2-year listening process to really understand, what they were confronting with the church in Latin America, and questions like how to transmit the faith from one generation to the next, and how to deal with tremendous social inequality, and all these sort of pressing issues. And they realized that in order to wrestle with them, they couldn't do it just among themselves. It had to be a collective exercise with all of the people of God. And they really learned something from that. And that was a formative experience for this Pope. And I think when he became Pope, he decided to invite the entire Universal Church to share in that process and experience. So I'd say that's one part of it. I'd also say, though, in the sort of the people that he chooses to invite to the table, I mean, I think it is quite extraordinary that, the Synod invited, the Pope invited some of his critics to be in the room at the Synod. So I think most notably of someone like Cardinal Gerhard Muller, who had warned that the Synod was a hostile takeover of the church. He's retired, he has no seat at the table by virtue of office, but the Pope wanted him in the room and invited him as one of his personal delegates to the Synod. I think that requires a lot of humility, and the Pope, I think, is constantly trying to act in a way that preserves unity, and I think he sees that as necessary to if synodality is to take effect. You have to bring people along with you.
Yeah, thank you. What's it like to travel with him every day? What's it like to follow him around every day? And I mentioned the papal plane.
Yeah.
He's doing a little less traveling now than he was a few years ago, right? But what's it like?
Actually, yes and no. The trips look a little differently now because they're not as scheduled as they were at the beginning. I mean, if you look at some of the itineraries for his trip in the first, few years, he'd do, 8 things a day. And now, you typically have 1 or 2 events before dinner, or 1 or 2 events before lunch, and another event or 2 after lunch, and that's it. But the number of trips, he's still doing, 4 or 5 trips a year. He's quite extraordinary, the amount of travel that he wants to do. And this past weekend, we were supposed to be in Dubai because he was going to speak at the COP Climate Summit. He had to bow out of that because his lingering issues with bronchitis. And he said that, because it's a hot climate, the doctors were worried about him going, from being outdoors where it's hot to inside of these massive air conditioning buildings, and that the effect that would have on him. And so I think that was a real, pain for him to have to cancel that experience, that trip, and have that experience of being the first pope to ever speak at a COP climate summit. But it's a fun, exhausting thing to travel with him. The one thing I often feel the need to correct people on is sort of a false, perhaps misconception that it's glamorous. It certainly is not. The Vatican does not own its own aircraft, so the Pope, when he decides to travel, the Vatican just charters a plane from ITA, the national carrier here in Italy. And the line of one of my colleagues is that we Vatican journalists pay business class airfare for coach class service, but we get good in-flight entertainment, and that very much feels true. So we sit at the back of the plane, and the journalists and our outlets are the ones that subsidize papal travel. So whatever it costs the Vatican, that cost is then just divided out among the journalists, and we pay for that. So I'm very fortunate that NCR believes it important for us to have a permanent seat on the plane and to follow the Pope wherever he goes. And the way to whatever country is a bit more relaxed, I'd say, because the Pope comes to the back of the plane and he greets us all individually. And we all have a few moments with him to, some colleagues will say, we'll give him a copy of a new book that they're working on, that they've just finished. Other colleagues will ask him for a particular, prayer or blessing. My strategy with him is to always get him laughing, because I think if you're carrying the weight of this job, it's good to laugh a bit, and he's a big fan of laughter, and he seems to appreciate that. And he does the greetings, and then of course we're also faced with preparing for our coverage once we land in whatever country we're going to. So if it's a long trip like Mongolia, the Pope comes to the back of the plane, spends an hour in the back of the plane, and you've still got 11 hours to prepare for the trip. So you've got plenty of time. But if it's a short flight within Europe, you're kind of scrambling a bit. But the real fireworks happen on the flight back to Rome at the end of the trip. It's the only time that the Pope officially meets the press. So we have an in-flight press conference, which is completely unscripted. We do not, he does not know what he's going to ask. So the questions are not submitted to him or to any Vatican official beforehand. And so we get to ask him, any questions. And it can range from questions about the trip itself. So the standard rule is that the first few questions have to always be about the trip itself. And then, we ask him a number of hot topics about, various matters that he's facing or the Vatican is confronted with. And those are often headline generating press conferences. And they can be very stressful because you're dealing with difficult sound conditions on board the plane. You don't have Wi-Fi, so you're trying to prepare your story for when you land. And if you want to look something up, you don't always have that luxury. And you're tasked with the job of getting the Pope's words right and translating that back to your readers. And so it's a great responsibility. So there's normally not much time for relaxation and fun on the flight home. That's serious business. So.
Well, everything you just said was great, and left me thinking there's a few things I want to ask very quickly. First of all, there's no Wi-Fi on the papal plane. You explain that to me. Secondly, what you just explained about the way that papal trips are funded means that at this moment, I should say that there's a banner going across the screen for everybody who's watching that you should subscribe to NCR or renew your subscription to NCR. And
Thank you, John.
Then I also want to ask, how's your Italian? How's your Spanish? What languages are you using when you're talking with the Pope?
Sure. So I speak to the Pope in Italian. I say that my Italian is serviceable, not beautiful. So I get by. What's exactly my Spanish is I can read Spanish decently, but despite studying it for 4 years in high school, long left me. But the Pope for these press conferences uses Italian. In terms of the Wi-Fi situation, yeah, it's kind of wild to think about. We're reliant on whatever technology that the carrier that we're traveling on has, and it's very rare for ITA to have functioning Wi-Fi. So every now and then we're lucky, and it comes on somewhere mid-flight, but it's rare. So
I would think it'd be pretty important for journalists to have Wi-Fi.
yeah, you would think, but the other thing that boggles people's mind as well is when we're inside St. Peter's Basilica for masses, there is no Wi-Fi connection for us. So we're having to use our phones for personal hotspots, and so that can be spotty as well. So it's not ideal. It's not ideal.
Well, I support that one. No Wi-Fi in church. I support that one.
I know. I would just like for there to be a small section for it to work for we journalists. So,
thank you very much, Chris White of NCR, for taking the time to be with us and our subscribers. And we wish you all the best for the holidays and into the new year. And those who are watching, support Chris's work at NCR. It's okay to do that and still subscribe to Living City. You can do both. And Chris, we
absolutely
back in our pages again soon also.
I look forward to it. Thank you, John, and thank you, everyone. I have great respect for John as a writer and editor, and for Focolare. So an honor to be with you all.
Thank you very much. All right. Ciao.
Ciao.